We're going to get started now. We have Kyle Cotter from HappyCog. He's going to be talking about empowering content editors by improving author experience. Just a quick note before we jump into that. Do make sure that you are filling out the speaker feedback form, eeconf.com/speaker-feedback. It's very helpful for us in the future to know what content you like, what you don't like, help shape that. So with that, here's Kyle.
So today we're going to be talking about empowering content editors. So a lot of conferences you go to nowadays, you'll hear things like Netlify, Vue, React, all these buzzwords. But today we're going to be talking about author experience. Author experience. Okay. Thank you. So your content authors, they don't care what your stack is. So you can have all these buzzwords, but in the end, we really care about what the experience is for those actually using their content management system. So before we get started, just to take a quick poll of the audience, how many here today are developers new to ExpressionEngine? Very nice. How many are developers who have a lot of experience with ExpressionEngine or other CMSs similar? Very nice. And then finally, how many here are content editors, content strategists, the ones working in the CMS? Very good. So we have a balance of sort of all three. We're going to talk today about what author experience really is and how, if you're a developer, that you can implement these principles on your projects, and if you're a content editor, how you can benefit by having these principles apply to your sites. So what is author experience? I define this as the level of usability, the organization of data, and the overall experience that an individual who's in the trenches editing their content on a regular basis, what that experience is for them. Now we refer to these ones as the author, the content editor, and we refer to this whole thing as author experience or AX. So really our goal as developers is to make the user of our CMS actually enjoy managing their content. Before we jump in to the meat of our talk, a little bit about me. My current role is the author experience lead at HappyCog. I formerly worked with Ellis Lab for a bit, working with ExpressionEngine. My role currently with HappyCog focuses on really establishing the principles and guidelines for the CMSs that we use. We use a number of really flexible content management systems. The day one of this conference is platform agnostic, so we're going to talk about a number of them and how really these 7 principles can apply to any of them. It doesn't have to be a specific piece of software. So that's what I do at HappyCog. I have an extensive background in PHP-based content management systems. I've been working with them over the last decade. Previous to HappyCog, I was a freelancer and doing all sorts of projects on different systems. Now, my specific role at HappyCog is to, as I mentioned, establish the principles, sort of our boilerplates for all of the CMSs we use, get our development team on the same page, make sure that terminology is consistent across projects so that we can onboard developers quickly between projects if necessary. So it's really taking the lead and putting the content editor first, as well as supporting our dev team in best practices. So we're going to look at 7 principles today that will allow us to up our author experience game. Now, before we jump into those principles, let's look at what we're going to be doing for the rest of this talk. We're going to look at what we're really dealing with, what types of sites where we use these types of CMSs on, what exactly do those sites look like, what do they consist of. Then we'll jump into those principles. Then we'll look at a practical demo. And then finally we'll do some Q&A. So let's get started with what we're dealing with. In my experience, I found that there's a spectrum of projects and sites that we're working on. You can really boil it down to 2 sides. You have structured data on one side, so sites that follow a very specific rigid structure, lots of custom fields that are labeled very specifically. And then on the other side of that, you have this concept of a flexible content builder, or sites that can be arranged in different ways, different modules, different blocks, ordering them whichever the content editor wants to. And then you have this infinite spectrum in between, where you have sites that are a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And using something like ExpressionEngine, we'll talk a little bit about craft. You're already 10 steps ahead of the game in that you can build a site that fits pretty much anywhere on this spectrum with those pieces of software. So let's look at a couple examples of each type. So first we'll look at a structured data site. This is a news organization website posting different articles. You'll see we have very specific fields that establish exactly what they're going to be doing. You notice the tabs at the top. We have different tabs doing different, containing different fields for different functions using a variety of different field types. Look at a comparable craft example. We have another, this is an event website that has very specific fields, very specific requirements. This was highlighting a festival. So all of those fields are very explicitly defined. Now let's look at a flexible content builder type of site. So structure with ExpressionEngine is a good way to pull off some of this custom page builder functionality where the client wants to order the navigation hierarchy in a specific way, or they want to add specific pages that perform different functions, and then you have your listings to add various pieces of that content that can get embedded in those sort of bigger pages. So the structure is a nice starting point to that. You can see how we structure that here. And then if we go into an actual entry, we have a couple different things we'll touch on, but this is using the blocks plugin from BoldMinded that lets us do some pretty crazy things in ExpressionEngine to get some of this custom page builder layout going. You'll notice we have our different block types like multi-columns and then adding some different columns. We have a single column block type. Then we have like a cards group that we can add different cards. And this is all within ExpressionEngine and gives us that flexibility to pull stuff like this off. So if we expand that, you can see a little bit that our blocks makeup have different fields in them, and we can reorder them and change the order of how this all displays on the fly. So really cool stuff. Here's a comparable example in craft. We're using the Neo field type here, if you're familiar with craft. Give the same functionality that we just looked at in ExpressionEngine. You can add different blocks. We've labeled them in specific ways so the client understands. Here's what you're getting when you click on this particular block. You'll notice there's previews of what these different blocks look like on the sidebar. So depending on, no matter which system, you can pull off the same flexible content builder type. So then finally, we're going to look here in the middle spectrum, sites that have a little bit on each side. So going back to our ExpressionEngine site, we're still having our page builder here with blocks, but you'll notice there's another block type there for our testimonial and quotes. And this is pulling information from our testimonials and quotes channel. And we're able to select that, and if we look at what that's consisting of, it's a testimonial, so we have our quote, attribution, an optional headshot or logo that we want to feature. So that's stored separately, and then we're able to include it in our page builder and indicate where we want this testimonial block to show up. And then finally, we'll look at a comparable example in craft. This was for a law firm. They have attorneys. In order to pull off some custom search functionality with Algolia and for just general layout, here are specific fields that need to be filled in for an attorney. All sorts of stuff, and then we'll also have some relation fields that need to be set up. So that's on the parent attorney page. This site had different tabs, so you had an attorney and then you had tabs of different content. So each attorney had an overview tab that had specific information about the attorney, and that's where this flexible page builder came into play. So you were actually able to add dynamic content on the fly, like body copy, which was specific to the overview page. But if they wanted to embed something like what languages does this attorney speak, which is pulling from those structured fields we had already set up, we're able to drop in a matrix block here that automatically fetches that data. So we don't have to make the content editor do any extra work. It's pulling from the field we already structured, but they still get that flexibility of saying, all right, we want to highlight this piece of content, let's stick it here. And there's the two different entries. One's more of a visual injection point, whereas the other is the actual structured data. So as you can see, with both of these content management systems, we can pull off pretty much anything on this spectrum. And that leads us into our principles that we're going to be talking about. It doesn't matter where exactly you fall on this spectrum. It's defining that up front and then using these principles to establish how you approach the project. So what principles are we going to be looking at? First off, making it personal, being consistent, being proactive, making it personal, being consistent, being proactive, being explicit, being prudent, and being flexible. That's what I get for looking ahead of my slides. So these 6 principles really all lead up to our big number 7, making a plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about each and then show how this all comes into making a plan, what that really consists of. And we have this model at HappyCog, putting people first. That's really our tagline, people first. And what this really means to us is it's our job as developers, project managers, to put ourselves in the shoes of the content editor. We do a lot of work with ExpressionEngine and Craft. How are they going to feel using our solution for them? Are they going to enjoy it? Is it going to make sense to them? Did we do our part in empowering them and putting them first? Is the client more technical? Do we not have to get as detailed in certain areas as we may have to for a less technical client? If they're less technical, maybe we have to include more instructions, more details, more explanations, more guides. So that's really up to us ahead of time to think through what's going to be best for this client. So let's start off with making it personal. Well, what does that really mean? Well, it means that it's theirs. The site that we're building for them, it's their site. We can have as many opinions as we want. Our job is to help them, but in the end, it's their site. It's their content, their data, it's their experience. We want to make it the best that we can. Now, what are some things that we can do to really make it feel like it's theirs? Well, first thing we can do is some custom branding. Very low-hanging fruit, some really simple things we can do. This can be on the login screen, maybe the sidebar or the top bar, adding their logo somewhere in the CMS. Some examples of that. This is ExpressionEngine control panel. There's a plugin that lets you throw some CSS in there and reskin things. Obviously, this is custom branded for HappyCog, so fitting our brand, it really feels like their site. Even if we don't want to go that complex, we can do some style adjustments this was a demo site I created. We'll look at this a little bit more, but have a different aesthetic that really fits into the brand of the particular client. Here's another example site with the logo for a different project that fits their aesthetic. And then you can do the same thing with Craft as well. Custom branded login screens, swapped out some logos for NDA purposes. You can even take this a step further. Here's an example in Craft where we've skinned the sidebar as well, matching branding. There's a lot of flexibility in what you can do here. And going back to the plugin or the add-on for ExpressionEngine that lets you style things, you can even come up with totally different layouts, whatever is best for the client. A couple more examples of some login screens. So that's step 1 to making it personal, making it theirs. Give them an experience that feels like theirs. We don't want to go overboard with it, so the login screen is a nice starting point for that. Second thing we can do is naming conventions. How do the content editors in the site actually refer to things? How do your clients refer to things? Are we using naming conventions that match their thought process? Yes, ExpressionEngine Craft has very specific naming conventions as well. Are you conveying those to the client? Is the client conveying to you what they're referring to things as? Are you having that happy medium where everything makes sense to your content editors? Again, we have very specific functionality here on this ExpressionEngine project where they need to add information about places, locales, and relationships within that. So we have fields that make sense to the client. This is what they asked for, how they specified that their content was structured, and this is how we provided that to them. Our next principle is being consistent. How can we do that? So being consistent really means being predictable in the experience that the editor is going to have. So we talked about naming conventions to how an editor actually interacts with different elements and different field types. What is their experience that they're getting there? Is it predictable? Is it the same across the site? Are similar functioning items set up the same way in different areas? Are you mixing fluid fields and block fields? You wouldn't want to do something like that. Let's start with naming conventions though. You'll notice here this is a fluid field. And we have things named like heading, subheading, rich text, 2-column block. We have a similar setup here with craft, subheading, heading, rich text. Now, you'll notice those are referring to the specific thing, the heading and the subheading. We're not calling something header when we really mean it's going to be in H1 or in H2, the specific heading. The header would be the entire block. So we have these principles and these naming conventions established ahead of time so that our whole development team is on the same page. It makes sense to our content editors so they know exactly what a particular field is going to be doing. So naming conventions are really important. The other thing, as we mentioned on, if we have a fluid field in one spot, we want to have similar functionality in a block field somewhere else. We want to be consistent, make sure that interaction is the same across the board. Same thing with craft. If we're using something like Matrix and something like Neo, we wouldn't want to cross those up if they're going to be interacting the same way across the site. So it's a service to the client when everything works the same way. So being consistent is really important for their sanity. Next, we want to be proactive. What do we mean by that? Well, we want to put ourselves in the shoes of our content editors. We want to test our setup, really test it, identify some pain points, and then we want to solve those pain points before we even hand it off to the clients. It's one thing to set up your fields, set up your channels, set up your sections, and then it's another thing to actually go in there and pretend you're the content editor going in there making those changes. Maybe there's a particular workflow that really annoys you. It's probably going to annoy them too. So take the first step in fixing it before it gets into their hands. There's a couple ways we can be proactive, and those come in the form of add-ons. There's some really nice user experience, author experience-based add-ons that we can install for the control panel that really elevates these things to the next level. Here's a few of them. We talked about blocks, giving you that really flexible page builder approach. There's a plugin called Vito, which is what we were using to get that custom branded login screen. You can do some pretty much custom branded ExpressionEngine themes, adjust the layout however you want. You have CSS and JavaScript injection points. CPCSS is a smaller utility that just injects CSS in the control panel. A big one that's really useful to us is publish notes. It's a field type that lets you just basically add instructions. You can indicate different statuses like warning, alert, call out that'll give some visual indication. And so we'll use that for instruction fields, indicating here's what this particular channel does or here's what this field does, and give them more context. And then we have things like low variables. It's been around forever, but it's really flexible in providing us global variables. For really flexible sites, we'll use that to give some color variable injection points where they can sort of define here's what the primary color of the site's going to be. We store that in a low variable. We mentioned structure. Allows the client to order things however they need. And then there's plugins like Zenbu that give additional functionality to the listing pages, custom filtering, custom ordering, all that type of stuff. So if your client needs something like that, you have these at your disposal to quickly improve the experience of the control panel. Then we have extending plugins and add-ons. You can write your own, do specific custom functionality that the client requests. So it's up to you to establish all that ahead of time, determine what the real needs of your content editors are, determine what comes out of the box with whatever CMS you're using, and then really expand on that if necessary. Some examples of that, again, Zenbu, you can control filtering options if needed. With Craft, you can do some custom filtering options too via a module or a plugin. All of this will improve the author experience if you communicate with your client upfront about what their needs really are. So let's look at some examples of what we're really talking about here. So again, this is in Craft, our page builder site. We have a number of different block types that we've established with the client, what things are going to be called, and they're listed here so that they can quickly insert them. This is using the Neo plugin for Craft, so it gives a little more functionality than Matrix does. This client really wanted a flexible site, so we gave them basically parent blocks that allowed them to insert wrapping containers, and then within that they could establish other different types of block types like heading, subheading, rich text, and control the order of that totally on the fly based on their needs. Some other things we did here, as you'll notice the tabs within this matrix field, everything was logically organized. We split out what fields were actually content-based versus what fields controlled some of the design aspects like width and color and things like that. On this particular project, and this goes to communicating with the client ahead of time, they pretty much asked us to give them CSS within Craft, which was something we pushed back on quite a bit, but they ultimately decided they have an in-house marketing team, in-house design team. They are capable of not abusing that power. So we built them a gradient builder within Craft with support for various color stops and shadows and all sorts of goodness. And that's displayed here. They're able to control the borders on call to action buttons and various other color palette related things. And when we agreed to do something like this, we had to be proactive because we realized that this could get out of hand very quickly. So we ended up taking another plugin that existed and extending it to indicate in the sidebar which elements are basically using this color scheme. So here's a list of all the entries that are using this color scheme. It's probably not a good idea to delete this color scheme or manipulate it unless you know what you're getting into. But that's nice if you're looking at a color scheme. We took it one step further. On the actual listing page, we have a column dedicated to indicating where or how many times a gradient is or a color scheme is being used. So that one is being used 28 times. Again, the marketing team will want to take caution before doing anything drastic to it. And you can pull off this same functionality in ExpressionEngine 2. Using low variables as globals and using a variety of different fields to create gradients and colors. But being proactive, you want to establish how crazy you want to get with it, and you can do a little simpler version that's might be smaller or better for smaller sites. I really advise not giving clients a whole CSS spec, but again, that's part of your job to figure that out. So let's look at being explicit. So we've done something crazy, like built them CSS in our CMS. Being explicit means we're going to document that for them, explain to them how to use it, along with all the other features of their CMS. We can't just hand it off to them and expect them to figure it out. So there's a couple ways that we can do this. There's some more passive ways to do it, and then there's some explicit ways to do it. One of the easiest things to do is just give them instructions in line within an entry form. This was that plugin we were talking about earlier. It lets you add various callouts to add instructions or whatever callouts you want to make on an entry page. We're instructing somebody how to use this particular field or particular channel. You can do the same thing with crafters and equivalent. Another thing we do, this one's called publish notes. Another thing we do is we'll sometimes take screenshots of various matrix blocks to give the client a preview of what they're adding is going to look like. These are just static screenshots, nothing's dynamic, but it gives them a quick reference point of this is what's going to look like. Within Craft, there's a plugin called Guide that actually lets you write documentation in the control panel. So it gives you a whole other section, and you can add as many manuals and help documents that you want so that your client never has to leave the control panel. We highly recommend, even if you're not using Craft, just to have documentation written somewhere that you can hand off to the client so that they can understand what's happening with their site. I think Marcus mentioned it during his talk, but we at HappyCog will record a video for all of our clients on how their particular site is set up and how it functions, and that's a deliverable that we provide to them so that they can always go back and listen to how we explain it to them so that they know how to use their site. Our next principle is being prudent. So we've just talked about how we can do a bunch of cool stuff for the client, but we also want to pause for a second and be balanced. This is very crucial, especially when you're using a platform like ExpressionEngine or Craft where it's so flexible, you can do so much with it, it's very easy to quickly take things out of hand. You don't want to over-engineer the project, and you don't want to use plugins or add-ons for the sake of using them. So it's up to you to sort of stop and think that through ahead of time. Based on what you know of the client, based on your discovery with the client, establish what their needs are. As mentioned, maybe they don't need as much documentation on a particular area because they are more technical, or maybe they have an in-house design team, so if you give them some style controls, it's on them not to abuse it. Whereas a client with no design experience, if you're going to give them some design controls, you want to limit that to maybe a switcher of light and dark or something like that. So that's up to you to establish what that balance really is. That leads us into being flexible. So what do we mean by this? Well, once you've handed over your project for initial testing by the client, they're going to use it. The actual content editors are going to go in there and test things out, and they can come back being confused. They could potentially not agree with something you had done on the workflow, even though you discussed it multiple times over many meetings. But once they get in there and actually test things, they just don't like it, or maybe they think something is particularly difficult. So that's on you as the developer to empower them, make sure they actually enjoy editing experience. So if it means going back and changing things, even if you don't necessarily agree, it's really in the client's best interest for you to do that. And it can be something just like renaming a field, renaming what the name is, changing the instructions to add a little more detail, if that's going to make things clearer for them. So it's up to you to really listen to your clients, understand where they're coming from, understand any pain points that they're experiencing, and then act on them. Obviously, we have constraints like budgets and whatnot, but if it's in the best interest of the client, we want to try and accommodate things like that. So that leads us to number 7, making a plan. So what do we mean by when we say making a plan? Well, we refer this as creating a content model. Now, you might say the content what? Now, if your answer to that was the content what, then we're going to need you to stop and close the control panel. So we enjoy the flexibility that comes with ExpressionEngine Craft. Out of the box, it's very quick and easy to start adding fields and channels and sections, but we don't want to get to that point until we have a plan, no matter how fun it is. So if we think back to our spectrum, we first need to establish where our site's going to fall on this spectrum. And this leads into a great segue from Uncle Ben: with great power comes great responsibility. So it's up to you to figure this out ahead of time instead of jumping straight in and editing things in the control panel. So that's where this idea of a content model comes in. We're going to consider a few things with it: what it is, how do we make one, what should it include, and what happens when we're done. So what is it? Well, at HappyCog, we consider this a client deliverable document spreadsheet, anything that is a one-to-one mapping of what our ExpressionEngine fields and channels are going to look like, or what our craft sections are going to look like, and then how we take the information architecture and the design from our other departments and how that gets translated into this one-to-one mapping with whatever CMS we're ending up using. So it's a deliverable, it's a document. It makes things really nice for the developer to, here's how we're going to actually set this up in the CMS. How exactly do we make one? Well, there's a number of tools that we can use. Our current personal favorite is Cotter. We learned about it from the Cotter from Panic, that they were changing the name of it and sold the rights, and I was curious what this other thing was. So it turns out it's Google Sheets on steroids. It's a mixture of Google Docs, Google Sheets, and has like a bunch of relational parts to it, so you can really spec out an ExpressionEngine or a craft site pretty easily with a tool like this. Then there's things like Airtable, Google Sheets, even mind mapping software like MindNode. It doesn't really matter what the tool is, it's the fact that you're stopping, putting thought into this, and planning this out with something. So what should this include? We include pretty much everything that is required to get an ExpressionEngine site up and running. Section name, handle, instructions, all of the various settings for a given channel, in the field settings. We map all of that out. Depends on the project and how in-depth the project is going to be. Depends on what developers we have on it. Our content model can range from just establishing the basics like field type, field name, handle, instructions, or we can get into the really nitty-gritty. It really depends on the project. But at the very least, we're including those basic pieces of information. Now, what happens when we're done creating this document? For us, it serves as the source of truth. We get the client to review it. We'll walk them through it, depending on if they're more technical or not. We'll tailor our deliverable of this content model to them. For the developers, we have a very detailed content model as to what's going to be built, and then we get the client's approval and work off of that. So anything that changes during this course, we make sure it gets recorded in the content model and make sure everyone's on board with it so there's no surprises for any of the developers. So let's look at some examples as to what this document looks like. So these are a sampling from a number of our projects. Coda there is on the left. That's an example of one of our craft content models. And the cool thing with this is if you have a large team within Coda, you can actually define like checking when things are approved or need to be reviewed. And we have this whole process so that the developer who's creating the content model will submit it to the technical lead on the project, and then everyone can get feedback, and there's commenting and whatnot, which you would expect from a piece of software like this. We've used Google Sheets before, you see, and then we've used mind mapping software. You can do really cool color filtering, just making it as easy as possible to get the breakdown of what your site's going to look like. Here's a closer example of some fields, some handles, some instructions. Like this was the start date, so it's a date and time field in Craft, and we have instructions and what the handle is. But the point is, the tool's not the important part. It's the fact that you're stopping to really think about these things before you get trigger happy in the control panel, clicking away. Author experience, providing good author experience, it's really a mindset that you need to have going into a project. It's not something that you can sort of tack on after the fact. It's a lot easier and cheaper to do up front if you have developers who are of the same mindset, who are focused on empowering the content editor. And when you do that, you'll have many superior projects in the end. The client will be happy, your content editors will be happy, everybody wins. So let's review our 7 principles. We want to make it personal, be consistent, be proactive, be explicit, be prudent, be flexible, and all of those lead into making a plan. So let's do a live demo, because those are always a good idea. And we're going to walk through 2 sort of demo sites. One's on ExpressionEngine, one's on Craft, of these principles. All right. So, how much time I got left? Sweet. So, this is our ExpressionEngine custom login screen. We're making it personal. This is the Craft equivalent, custom brand and login screens. Once we get into the content management system, we'll have our familiar dashboard. We'll have some very specific navigation links for the client. We've thought about what they're going to be using most, and we've included those. So this is a flexible page builder type site. And so we have a structure here that houses all of that. And we have a quick link to that. We mentioned design settings, so we have some low variables set up here. They'll let them define a gradient, some button colors, a little bigger. And should have done this first. Let me give you some context as to what we'll be looking at. So this is a simple little marketing type site I threw together for this talk. Very basic, 2-column, single column, some pictures, call to actions, cards, things like that. So no matter which CMS, you can come up with something like this. It's a mixture of structured content and flexible page builder content. This is the Craft side of things. You'll notice we have our documentation in line, and can easily get an overview if you're the content editor as to what's going on. Craft has a pretty robust entries listing set up, so we have a dedicated pages and navigation section here, similar to what we do with structure. And we'll have some instructions injected into the top here to give the client a little more context as to what these particular things do. We have some nice color coding in this as well. And then if we hop back to our ExpressionEngine site, and if we actually go into edit one of these entries, you'll notice here we have our blocks field type here. We also have, just for an example, a fluid field type that you can pull off very similar functionality with this flexible page builder approach. You have different block types that you can define and add them on the fly here. So it's up to you to pick one and then stick with it. Make sure you're consistent across the board. So looking at the example of this blocks add-on, you can see we have cards. Each card, you can add a heading, subheading, rich text, call to action, their instruction set for each of them. So we're being proactive in establishing what the options are for the client. Here's an example of some related content. We have our testimonial block. Oops. This is simply just a relationship pulling from our testimonials and in quotes channel, and we can reorder these if we ever need to, and that'll change the visual layout for the client. Same thing on the Craft side of things. If we're looking at the home page, Very similar setup. We have our blocks here where you can add our different block types, so single columns, call to action, multiple columns, and then the client can actually add these things on the fly and reorder them any way they want. So if they want to do rich text and then heading, they can. Not necessarily why they want to, but if they've requested something like that, we can accommodate in the design the different flexible things that they need to be able to pull off. This example, we have a very basic style editor for them. They determine one primary gradient that can be used throughout the site. They can establish a various amount of link color and primary background color, or light and dark background color. And then within the entry themselves, we've separated everything into content tabs. So this is the actual content that the editor is working in. And then the design tab simply has a drop-down that they can select what's been predefined from the global. So not as in-depth as having to create a ton of gradients on the fly within CSS in the control panel, but for this particular project, this gave them that flexibility of giving them some design options, but not letting them go overboard with it. And again, we have a very similar setup in ExpressionEngine. Low variables, create the gradient, color opacity, add some colors for links and background colors, and you can pull off the same thing for both. So that's a pretty high-level overview of how you can start and think about the author experience for your clients. You can accomplish it. It's CMS agnostic, these principles. If you're really thinking about them first, labeling things correctly, thinking what their needs are, you'll be in a really good spot to improve the author experience for your clients. So step one, establish where your project's going to fall in the spectrum. There isn't a right answer for this. It's up to you to figure out what you're going to build for your client based on their needs. With ExpressionEngine Craft, you can, as we mentioned, build anything on the spectrum, and the client might not know what they want. That's up to you to help figure that out. And there's no right answer based on your understanding of information in the project. You can figure out what's going to be best for them. And once you figure that out, you want to start off thinking about these first 6 principles of making it personal, being consistent, being proactive, being explicit, prudent, flexible. And when you do all that, and when you go into the project with this mindset, then it'll lead into principle number 7 of making a plan. You think about all those things up front, you plan it in a document, you stop and close the control panel, you plan everything out, and then you execute on that. Everyone will enjoy the project, your content editors will enjoy managing it, and you'll be really happy with the results. Thank you. You can find me on Twitter at Kyle Cotter, and any questions? Yes?
What was that plugin you used for the visual examples and instructions on fields? Is that a custom thing or is that an optional thing?
In Craft, you mean? So yeah, that was an example of us extending Craft with a module. We just determined what matrix block type somebody was hovering over and then loading a static image based on that same field name. It was just JavaScript. Yep. Very good. Thank you, guys.